Nestled in the heart of a serene valley, the lakeside community had long been a haven for those seeking tranquility and camaraderie. The lake, which glistened like a mirror under the morning sun, served as the community's lifeblood. It was a place where families gathered for weekend picnics, children learned to swim, and neighbors bonded over fishing or grilling by the water's edge. For the longest time, life here had been almost utopian, a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other by name, and doors were left unlocked without a second thought. The narrator, a long-time resident, had lived in this peaceful enclave for over a decade. He cherished the quiet rhythm of life here. Early mornings were spent fishing by the lake, and afternoons often involved barbecuing fresh catches with friends. The lake itself was private, with each resident owning a portion of the shoreline. Yet, despite the divided property lines, there had never been disputes. Everyone respected one another's space and privacy. Neighbors frequently held potlucks, and the community had a standing tradition of hosting annual celebrations by the water, with music, laughter, and the scent of grilled fish and steak wafting through the air. It was a place where problems felt distant, and joy was always close at hand. That is, until Karen moved in. Karen arrived in the community one sweltering afternoon in mid-July. She was hard to miss. The moving truck, emblazoned with bright red letters, screeched to a halt in front of the vacant house at the edge of the lake, a charming property with ivy-covered walls and a small dock jutting out into the water. Karen herself emerged moments later, dressed in a spotless white sundress and sunglasses the size of saucers. At first, everyone was curious. New neighbors were always welcomed with open arms here, and some of the long-time residents immediately began planning a casual barbecue to introduce her to the community. However, Karen's demeanor was anything but welcoming. "Hi there! Welcome to the neighborhood," chirped Lisa, a cheerful woman from 2 houses down, as she approached Karen with a warm smile and a plate of freshly baked cookies. Karen's expression remained neutral. "Thanks," she said curtly, glancing at the cookies with thinly veiled disdain. "Are these vegan?" No," Lisa stammered, caught off guard. "They're chocolate chip. My grandmother's recipe." Karen didn't respond. She turned her back on Lisa and walked away without another word. Over the next few days, Karen's odd behavior continued. She refused to make eye contact with anyone, avoided neighborhood gatherings, and glared at the narrator each morning as he loaded his fishing gear into his small boat. Despite this, most residents gave her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she just needs time to adjust, they reasoned. It wasn't long before Karen's true colors began to show. A few weeks after her arrival, the narrator and several neighbors gathered at his backyard to grill freshly caught fish. The aroma of sizzling fillets filled the air, mingling with laughter and conversation. The peaceful evening was interrupted by a loud, high-pitched screech. "Stop it! Stop it right now!" Karen stormed through the narrator's yard, her face red with fury. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're killing innocent beings. You're eating death." The group fell silent, stunned by her sudden outburst. "This is our property," the narrator finally said, keeping his tone measured. "We're just having dinner." "It's disgusting," Karen spat. "And it's harmful to the environment. You should be ashamed of yourselves." From that moment on, Karen made it her mission to police the eating habits of the entire community. She patrolled the neighborhood, lecturing anyone who dared to cook meat. She left handwritten notes in mailboxes, filled with statistics about animal cruelty and the benefits of a plant-based diet. She even confronted the local grocery store owner, demanding that they remove all meat products from their shelves. No one was spared from Karen's crusade. Even children enjoying hot dogs by the lake were subjected to her lectures. Parents began keeping their kids indoors to avoid confrontations, and the once bustling community began to feel stifled. Karen's confrontational nature only escalated over time. She began standing on her dock with a pair of binoculars, watching the narrator intently as he fished. Any time he caught something, she would shout accusations across the water. "Murderer!" she screamed one morning, her voice carrying over the lake's surface. The narrator tried his best to ignore her, but Karen's presence was impossible to ignore. She followed him to the local market, making loud, disparaging comments about the fish he purchased. When he grilled outside, she would appear at the edge of his property, arms crossed and eyes blazing with fury. It didn't stop there. Karen took to tearing down the narrator's "no trespassing" signs, claiming they were an affront to community unity. She even placed a small protest sign at the edge of his property, which read, "Fish have feelings too." Despite multiple complaints from neighbors, Karen remained unapologetic. "I have every right to speak out against cruelty," she declared during one heated confrontation. "And I will not be silenced." By now, it was clear to everyone that Karen had a personal vendetta against the narrator. She no longer limited her harassment to public confrontations. She began actively invading his privacy. One evening, as the narrator grilled on his patio, Karen appeared out of nowhere, standing just a few feet away. "Do you enjoy killing?" she asked, her tone eerily calm. "Does it make you feel powerful?" The narrator was taken aback. "I'm cooking dinner. That's all." Karen stepped closer, her eyes glinting with a strange light. "You can't hide from the truth forever. The blood is on your hands." Feeling genuinely unsettled, the narrator reported the incident to the local authorities. The police issued Karen a formal warning, but it did little to deter her. She began leaving threatening notes on the narrator's doorstep, each one more unhinged than the last. "I'm watching you," read one note. "Justice is coming," read another. The once peaceful community had become a battleground, and the narrator found himself at the center of Karen's obsessive crusade. Despite the mounting tension, he resolved to stand his ground. After all, he had every right to live his life without fear or intimidation. But Karen wasn't done yet, and her next move would be more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. The breaking point for the community came a few weeks later when Karen launched a formal campaign to ban fishing in the entire neighborhood. One morning, brightly colored flyers began appearing in mailboxes and on doorsteps, all bearing the bold title, "Ban the Brutality, Stop Fishing Now." The flyer was filled with graphic images of fish, along with alarmist statements about environmental damage and the psychological toll of consuming death. Karen went door to door, clipboard in hand, demanding signatures for her petition. The narrator was one of the first to receive a knock at his door. "Sign this," Karen said bluntly, holding out the clipboard. "No," the narrator replied without hesitation. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Don't you care about the planet? About life?" "I care about my right to fish on my own property," he said firmly. "And I'm not signing anything." Karen's face twisted in frustration. "You're complicit in murder," she hissed before storming off. Despite her aggressive tactics, most of the community refused to sign the petition. Fishing had always been a beloved pastime, and no one wanted to see it banned because of one person's extremist views. However, Karen managed to gather a small group of supporters, most of whom were newcomers unfamiliar with the community's traditions. The tension in the neighborhood grew thicker by the day. Friends who had once gathered for fishing trips and lakeside picnics now felt uncomfortable, constantly looking over their shoulders for Karen's watchful eyes. The narrator, determined to stand his ground, continued fishing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. One stormy evening, the narrator returned home after running errands to find his boat in ruins. The small vessel, which he had carefully maintained for years, had been smashed beyond recognition. Its hull was split in two, the wood splintered and jagged. Fishing rods and nets were strewn across the dock, many of them snapped in half. His heart pounded as he surveyed the damage. This was no accident. Someone had deliberately sabotaged his property. Karen's face immediately came to mind. He called the police, who arrived shortly after to take a report. "Do you have any suspects?" one officer asked. The narrator hesitated. "I can't prove it, but I have my suspicions." The officer nodded but didn't offer much hope. "We'll investigate, but without witnesses or evidence, it's tough to pin this on anyone." The next morning, Karen was spotted walking along the lake with a smug expression. She didn't say a word, but the narrator could feel her gaze lingering on him. It was as if she was silently daring him to confront her. Despite the police report, the community began to murmur about the incident. Rumors swirled, and neighbors became more cautious. The once open, trusting atmosphere had been replaced by fear and suspicion. Determined not to be victimized again, the narrator took action. He installed security cameras around his property, positioning them to capture every angle of the dock, yard, and lakeside area. If Karen or anyone else tried to cause more damage, there would be proof this time. For the next few days, life seemed to return to a fragile normalcy. The narrator resumed his morning fishing routine, keeping a watchful eye on his surroundings. The cameras remained unobtrusive but ever-present, a silent reminder of the ongoing tension. Then, one night, the cameras caught something. At 2:13 a.m., a shadowy figure appeared at the edge of the narrator's dock. The figure moved stealthily, inspecting the area before disappearing into the darkness. Although the footage was grainy and the figure's face was obscured, the narrator was convinced it was Karen. He showed the footage to the police, but once again, they were hesitant. "It's not enough to identify her," the officer said. "We need something clearer." Frustrated but undeterred, the narrator shared the footage with a few trusted neighbors. Word spread quickly, and soon, more residents began installing their own surveillance systems. Karen's behavior had pushed the entire community to a state of vigilance. One sunny afternoon, Karen called a community meeting at the local park. Flyers were distributed with bold lettering, a call for change, end the exploitation of lake life. Despite their reluctance, most residents attended. They wanted to hear what Karen had to say, and many hoped it would be an opportunity to finally address the growing tensions. Karen stood on a makeshift stage, dressed in her usual pristine white attire. She held a megaphone and began speaking with a self-righteous fervor. "This lake belongs to all of us," she declared. "It is a sacred living entity that deserves our respect and protection. Fishing is a barbaric practice that has no place in our community. Today, I'm giving you all a choice: either ban fishing or face the consequences." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many were stunned by the audacity of her ultimatum. The narrator stepped forward. "You can't dictate how we live our lives, Karen. This community has been fishing for generations. It's part of who we are." Karen's eyes blazed with fury. "Then prepare for war," she said coldly. With that, she turned on her heel and marched away, leaving the community in stunned silence. True to her word, Karen escalated her campaign in the days that followed. She began plastering the neighborhood with posters depicting gruesome images of dead fish, accompanied by slogans like "Lake of Death" and "Stop the Slaughter." She even went as far as dumping buckets of red dye into the lake, causing the water near her property to turn a ghastly shade of crimson. The narrator confronted her one morning, unable to contain his anger any longer. "What's wrong with you? You're destroying the very lake you claim to protect." Karen remained defiant. "Sometimes, you have to make a statement," she said. "This is just the beginning." The community was at its breaking point. Parents kept their children away from the lake, fearing further contamination. Several neighbors reported Karen's actions to the authorities, but once again, there was little they could do without concrete evidence. The narrator, now more determined than ever, began rallying the community. Together, they planned to hold a town hall meeting to address Karen's behavior once and for all. It was time to take a stand, but they knew Karen wouldn't back down without a fight. The town hall meeting was held in the community center, a modest building with wooden walls and folding chairs. By the time the meeting began, every seat was taken. Residents who had never spoken out before were present, driven by the growing fear that Karen's actions were spiraling out of control. The narrator stood at the front of the room, flanked by a few other longtime residents. They had prepared statements, determined to present a united front. Karen arrived late, as if to make a grand entrance. She walked in wearing a stark white outfit, carrying a folder stuffed with papers. Her supporters trailed behind her, most of them looking uneasy. The meeting began with the narrator giving a speech about the importance of tradition and the community's deep connection to the lake. "We fish not just for sport," he said, "but to honor the generations that came before us. This lake is part of our identity." Karen listened with a stony expression. When it was her turn to speak, she took the floor with an air of superiority. "Tradition is not an excuse for cruelty," she declared. "Just because something has been done for years doesn't make it right. The lake deserves better than to be treated as a hunting ground." The debate that followed was heated. Residents voiced their frustrations, while Karen doubled down on her stance. At one point, tempers flared so intensely that the moderator had to step in to prevent a full-blown shouting match. In the end, no resolution was reached. Karen stormed out, vowing to take her fight to the next level. A few days later, the narrator received a letter in the mail. It was from Karen's lawyer. The letter accused him, and several other residents, of violating environmental protection laws. It claimed that their fishing practices were harmful to the lake's ecosystem and demanded that they cease all fishing activities immediately. Failure to comply, the letter warned, would result in legal action. The narrator was stunned. He had never imagined that Karen would escalate the conflict to this level. Many of his neighbors received similar letters, and panic began to spread throughout the community. Some residents, fearing costly legal battles, stopped fishing altogether. Others, however, refused to back down. The narrator consulted a local attorney, who assured him that Karen's claims were baseless. "She doesn't have a case," the attorney said. "This is just a scare tactic." Despite the reassurance, the stress of the situation weighed heavily on everyone. Karen's actions were tearing the community apart, and there seemed to be no end in sight. Late one night, the narrator's security cameras captured a shocking scene. Karen was seen sneaking onto his property, armed with a bucket of red dye. She poured the dye into the lake, staining the water once again. This time, there was no doubt about her identity. The footage was crystal clear. The narrator immediately called the police and provided them with the video evidence. Finally, they had the proof they needed to take action. Karen was arrested the next morning. The news spread quickly, and for the first time in weeks, the community felt a sense of relief. However, Karen's arrest only fueled her supporters' anger. They claimed that she was being unfairly targeted and vowed to continue her campaign. Despite the lingering tension, the community began to rally together. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now spoke out in defense of their traditions. They organized events to celebrate the lake, including a fishing tournament and a lakeside picnic. The narrator took the lead, determined to restore a sense of peace and unity. "We can't let one person's actions define our community," he said at a neighborhood gathering. "This lake belongs to all of us, and we have to protect both its traditions and its future." The events were a success, drawing large crowds and reigniting a sense of camaraderie. Karen's influence began to wane, and her supporters grew quietly. Karen was released on bail after spending a few days in jail. When she returned to the neighborhood, she was met with a mixture of hostility and indifference. Undeterred, she resumed her campaign, but her efforts were less effective. Most residents had grown tired of her antics, and many of her supporters had distanced themselves from her. Karen, however, remained determined. She began spreading rumors about the narrator, accusing him of harassment and intimidation. She even claimed that he had tampered with the security footage to frame her. The narrator refused to engage with her accusations, focusing instead on strengthening the community's bonds. One evening, the narrator received an unexpected visitor, one of Karen's former supporters. The man, who introduced himself as Tom, seemed nervous but sincere. "I think Karen's gone too far," Tom admitted. "She's alienating everyone, and I don't want to be part of it anymore." Tom suggested a compromise, a designated no-fishing zone near Karen's property, along with stricter guidelines for sustainable fishing practices. The narrator considered the proposal. While he had no obligation to make concessions, he saw an opportunity to de-escalate the conflict. "If it means peace, I'm willing to discuss it," he said. A mediation meeting was arranged, with a neutral third party overseeing the discussion. Karen arrived with a combative attitude, but the mediator quickly established ground rules to keep the conversation civil. Tom presented the compromise, and the narrator expressed his willingness to cooperate. However, Karen rejected the proposal outright. "This isn't about compromise," she said. "It's about justice. And I won't stop until fishing is banned completely." The community grew more united in their opposition to Karen. Even those who had once sympathized with her cause began to distance themselves. The narrator, determined to protect his home and community, filed a restraining order against Karen. The court granted the order, prohibiting her from coming near his property or engaging in further harassment. One evening, a powerful storm swept through the neighborhood. Heavy rain and strong winds battered the area, causing flooding near the lake. Several residents worked together to secure their homes and rescue stranded animals. In the midst of the chaos, Karen's property was damaged. Her dock collapsed, and her garden was washed away. Despite everything, the community came together to help her. The narrator led a group of volunteers to repair her dock and restore her garden. Karen was visibly moved by the gesture. For the first time, she seemed to realize the impact of her actions on the community. In the days that followed, Karen's demeanor changed. She stopped her protests and began attending community events. While she never fully abandoned her beliefs, she expressed a willingness to listen and learn. The narrator and Karen eventually sat down for a conversation. "I don't expect you to agree with me," Karen said, "but I want to find a way for us to coexist." Together, they worked out a plan to promote sustainable fishing practices and environmental stewardship. The community embraced the initiative, and a sense of peace finally returned to the neighborhood. Though the road had been long and difficult, the community emerged stronger and more united than ever. And while Karen remained a passionate advocate for her cause, she had learned the value of compromise and community.